November 22nd, 1963. Hickory Hill, McLean, Virginia. 1:45 in the afternoon, Eastern Time. The autumn sun cuts low across the water of the swimming pool, and the estate is quiet in the way that only large properties can be. That particular kind of stillness that belongs to wealth and space, and a Friday afternoon with nowhere urgent to be. Robert Francis Kennedy, 37 years old, Attorney General of the United States, the second most powerful man in the American government, is eating lunch poolside with members of his staff. There are sandwiches. There is easy conversation. There is the ordinary texture of a life that has no idea it is about to end. The phone rings inside the house. Ethel Kennedy answers it. Those who were present that afternoon would later describe the moment her face changed. Not gradually, instantly, as if something essential had been removed from behind her eyes in a single breath. She walks out to the pool and hands the phone to her husband, and she says only 3 words. It's J. Edgar Hoover. Kennedy takes the phone. He knows this is unusual. Hoover never calls directly. Hoover is not a man who delivers news personally unless the news is the kind that cannot be delegated. The FBI director's voice, when it comes through the line, is cold, controlled. Those who have studied Hoover's psychology have noted something that survivors from that call would later confirm. There was, beneath the measured tone, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. The president's been shot in Dallas. It may be fatal. Kennedy's body contorts. His free hand goes to his face. He does not speak for several seconds. Around him, the afternoon continues. The water of the pool catches the light, and somewhere in Dallas, Texas, in a motorcade that had turned off Main Street onto Elm, his brother is already gone, though Kennedy does not yet know it with certainty. Within minutes, he pulls aside his aide, Ed Guthman, and he says something quietly, something that Guthman will carry with him for the rest of his life. Something that will only make sense later, when people begin asking harder questions about what Robert Kennedy knew, and when he knew it, and what he did with that knowledge. There's so much bitterness. I thought they'd get one of us. I thought it would be me. He didn't say, if they get one of us. He didn't say, I'm afraid they might. He said, I thought they'd get one of us, as though the threat had been real and present and expected, as though the only variable had been the name. What followed in the next several hours tells us more about Robert Kennedy's state of mind than anything he ever said publicly. He did not wait for official reports from Dallas. He did not call the Dallas Police Department. He did not contact the Secret Service. He did not reach out to the FBI, the agency whose director had just delivered the news to him. Instead, within hours of his brother's death, he began making his own calls, his own investigation. Private, urgent, bypassing every official channel that existed. His first call went to the CIA, and the question he asked was direct. Did you kill my brother? To understand why that was his first question, you have to understand what Robert Kennedy knew. As Attorney General, he had not simply overseen the Justice Department. He had been given, by his brother, an extraordinary window into the darkest operations of the American national security state. He knew about the CIA's plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, plots that had involved some of the most dangerous organized crime figures in the country. He knew about the covert operations surrounding Cuba, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the continuing sabotage efforts, the shadow war that had been fought just below the surface of American foreign policy throughout the Kennedy presidency. He knew the connections, tangled and toxic, between intelligence agencies and criminal organizations. He had spent 3 years pursuing those same criminal organizations through the courts, and in doing so he had made enemies unlike any attorney general before him had made. He knew his brother had made enemies, powerful ones, enemies with means. So he made 3 calls that day. The first to a CIA desk officer at Langley, asking directly whether the agency had been involved. The second to CIA Director John McCone, who rushed to Hickory Hill personally, arriving within hours. They spent approximately 3 hours together behind closed doors. Kennedy later told historian Arthur Schlesinger that he had asked McCone point-blank, "Did the CIA kill my brother?" McCone said no. The third call went to Enrique Harry Ruiz Williams, a Bay of Pigs veteran and Kennedy's closest personal contact within the Cuban exile community. The same question. Did anti-Castro Cubans kill Jack? Notice what is entirely missing from that list of calls. The Attorney General of the United States, on the day his brother was murdered, never contacted a single Dallas authority. Never expressed confidence in the official investigation that was already being assembled. Never mentioned the name Lee Harvey Oswald, which had already begun to surface in early reports from Texas, because Bobby Kennedy had a list of suspects and Oswald wasn't on it. The CIA had profound reasons to want John Kennedy dead. After the Bay of Pigs disaster in April 1961, Kennedy had fired CIA Director Allen Dulles and publicly vowed to break the agency into 1,000 pieces. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the CIA and the Joint Chiefs had pushed hard for military invasion. Kennedy had refused and then had secretly negotiated a settlement that removed American missiles from Turkey, a concession that elements within the national security establishment viewed as surrender. The agency felt betrayed, emasculated, overruled by a president who didn't trust it and had made that distrust visible. The Mafia had equally serious grievances. Robert Kennedy's anti-crime crusade was unprecedented in American history. He had doubled the number of Justice Department lawyers working organized crime cases. Prosecutions of mob figures had increased by 800% between 1960 and 1963. Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans crime boss, who controlled much of the Gulf Coast, had been deported in a Kennedy-ordered operation, then smuggled himself back in, and had made specific, credible threats against the president. Santos Traficante, who ran operations out of Tampa and had deep ties to Cuban exile communities, had told associates that Kennedy was going to be hit. Sam Giancana in Chicago had expressed the same sentiment with less subtlety. And then there were the anti-Castro Cubans, an entire community of exiles who had trained for liberation, who had landed at the Bay of Pigs, believing that American air support would come, and who had been abandoned on the beach to be captured or killed. They blamed Kennedy personally, passionately. Some of them, in the years following, would say so publicly. But there was one more suspect. One Bobby could not investigate. One who now sat in the Oval Office. Lyndon Baines Johnson. The relationship between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson was, by November 1963, one of the most corrosive personal antagonisms in American political life. It had begun in 1960 when John Kennedy chose Johnson as his running mate, a decision made over Bobby's fierce and vocal objections. Bobby had called Johnson a bully and worse. Johnson had seen Bobby as a spoiled, arrogant child playing at power, a rich kid who had never suffered, who had never had to fight for anything, who had gotten his position because of his father's money and his brother's charisma. The contempt was mutual and absolute. During the Kennedy presidency, Bobby made certain that Lyndon Johnson understood his position. The vice president was invited to meetings, yes, but consulted on nothing. He sat in corners at gatherings that should have been his domain, humiliated, powerless, a man who had once run the Senate with an iron grip, now reduced to attending lunches where his opinions were neither sought nor welcomed. Biographers who have written about this period describe Johnson during those 3 years as a man in genuine psychological crisis, by turns furious and defeated. Meanwhile, Bobby Kennedy wielded the Attorney General's office in ways that cut directly into Johnson's power base. He went after organized crime figures with connections to Texas oil money, to Johnson's political network, to the circles of favor and corruption through which Johnson had built his career. He pushed civil rights legislation that threatened the Southern Democratic coalition Johnson depended on. He investigated defense contract corruption tied to companies in Johnson's home state. And by the autumn of 1963, the Kennedy brothers were preparing to drop Lyndon Johnson from the 1964 ticket. Multiple sources, including people within the White House itself, have confirmed this. Johnson knew it. And Johnson was also facing something else, a gathering storm of scandal. His protege Bobby Baker had been caught in a corruption web that was rapidly expanding. Life magazine was preparing an exposé. Senate investigators were moving in. By November 22, 1963, Lyndon Johnson was, depending on how the next several months unfolded, either the Vice President of the United States in an administration that didn't want him, or a disgraced former official facing possible criminal exposure. And then, in Dallas, in his state, on a motorcade route that had been changed at the last moment, the president was shot. And Lyndon Johnson became the most powerful man in the world. That evening, Robert Kennedy arrived at Andrews Air Force Base as Air Force One touched down. The casket was being unloaded from the rear. And there was Johnson, newly sworn in, standing at the top of the stairs. Kennedy moved past him without acknowledgement, without a word, without a glance. Witnesses described Kennedy's expression not as grief, though grief was there, but as fury, contained, deliberate, absolute fury. The next day, Johnson summoned Kennedy to the White House, to his brother's office, to the chair behind his brother's desk. Johnson wanted Kennedy to stay on as Attorney General, wanted the appearance of continuity, wanted the Kennedy name attached to his administration. Kennedy told friends afterward that sitting across from Johnson in that room was almost more than he could endure. "I can't stand the sight of him," he said. But publicly, Bobby played along. He attended cabinet meetings. He cooperated with the transition. He even, when the moment came, issued a statement supporting the Warren Commission, the body that Johnson had appointed to investigate his brother's murder, a body whose membership included Allen Dulles, the very CIA director John Kennedy had fired. On September 27, 1964, the Warren Commission released its 888-page report. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, had shot the president from a window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. There was no conspiracy. The case was closed. Robert Kennedy issued a public statement. The commission's inquiry was thorough and conscientious. Privately, he told Arthur Schlesinger something else entirely. He believed it was a poor job. He would not endorse it. But he was unwilling to criticize it and thereby reopen the whole tragic business. His son, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., would later describe his father's real assessment in stark terms. Bobby called it a shoddy piece of craftsmanship. He was dismissive of it. He believed with near certainty that multiple people had conspired to kill his brother, and he was doing something about it quietly, carefully, out of public view. Kennedy had Justice Department investigators examining the assassination, specifically looking at phone records connecting Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who had shot Oswald in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters on November 24, 1963, on live national television, destroying the only man who could tell the public what he knew. The phone records Kennedy's people found read, as one investigator reportedly described them, like an inventory of organized crime. Marcello, Trafficante, Giancana. All three men Bobby had personally targeted in his anti-crime crusade. All three connected to CIA operations. All three, in various documented ways, connected to Jack Ruby. Ruby, it emerged, had not simply been a nightclub owner with strong feelings about the Kennedy family. He had been part of networks that crossed the line between intelligence operations and criminal enterprise many times. Bobby Kennedy understood what the evidence was pointing toward. He understood what he could not say publicly, what saying publicly would accomplish. Nothing except his own destruction and the burial of every remaining avenue for accountability. Without the presidency, any investigation could be blocked. Any prosecutor could be pressured. Any witness could disappear. He had watched exactly that happen already. So he built his strength the way a man builds a case. Methodically, patiently, he ran for Senate from New York in 1964. He won. He gave himself a platform, a national voice, subpoena power if he needed it. He became the face of the anti-war movement as Vietnam consumed American life and American sons. He championed the poor, the displaced, the communities that had been left behind by the expanding prosperity of the 1960s. He spoke to black Americans, to Latino workers in the California fields, to white working-class families in Indiana who had voted for Eisenhower and Nixon and now found themselves uncertain about everything. He became, by 1967 and into 1968, the most compelling political figure in the country. More compelling, the polls suggested, than Lyndon Johnson himself. And he prepared for his moment. He called it the Dallas File. Associates who were trusted with knowledge of its existence described a collection of evidence, documents, witness statements, documented connections between the CIA, organized crime, the anti-Castro exile community, and the highest levels of political power. He told close confidants that if he won the presidency, his first act would not be a speech or a ceremony or a policy announcement. It would be the appointment of a special prosecutor with full authority to reopen the investigation into his brother's murder. Heads will roll, he told friends. March 16, 1968, 10:00 in the morning, Senate Caucus Room, Washington, D.C. Robert Kennedy stood before cameras and announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. He spoke about Vietnam, about the divisions tearing the country apart, about the need for new leadership that understood the human cost of the choices being made in Washington. He did not mention Dallas. He was careful, strategic. He understood that openly attacking the official account of his brother's assassination would be used to dismiss him, to paint him as unstable, consumed by grief and personal grievance. So he held it. He waited. Win the White House first, then open the file. 2 weeks after Kennedy entered the race, Lyndon Johnson made a stunning announcement on national television. He would not seek and would not accept the Democratic nomination for president. He was done. In the spring of 1968, with McCarthy faltering and the Democratic establishment in disarray, Robert Kennedy was on a path that looked, to many serious observers, like it could only end one way. The California primary on June 4th seemed to confirm it. 46% of the vote. The path was clear. Shortly after midnight on June 5th at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, Robert Kennedy stood at a podium in the Embassy Ballroom before 1,800 supporters and delivered his victory speech. He thanked his campaign staff, thanked the farm workers, thanked the black community of Los Angeles. He made a joke about his dog. The room was euphoric in the way that only victory rooms know how to be. That particular combustion of exhaustion and possibility and the feeling that history is tilting in your direction. He finished. He thanked them again. He said, "And now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." He stepped away from the podium. His security team guided him through a back corridor, through the kitchen of the hotel, a shortcut to where the press was waiting. He stopped, as he often did, to shake hands with the kitchen staff. He was relaxed, smiling. The guards around him had shifted formation. At 12:13 in the morning, a man named Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, 24 years old, stepped from behind a dish cart and fired multiple shots at point-blank range. Kennedy fell. At 1:44 in the morning on June 6, 1968, Robert Francis Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. He had entered the presidential race 82 days earlier. He was, by every credible measure, months from the presidency, months from the Dallas File, months from whatever it was he had spent 5 years preparing to do. Did Lyndon Johnson kill John Kennedy? There is no document that establishes it. There is no confession. What exists is a pattern of evidence that serious historians have spent decades refusing to look at directly. the motive that was absolute and existential, the opportunity that existed in territory Johnson controlled completely, the outcome that rescued him from destruction and elevated him to supremacy, and the subsequent behavior of a man who controlled the investigation into his predecessor's death and shaped every aspect of what that investigation would find and conclude. And there is this. The investigators Lyndon Johnson chose for the Warren Commission, the timeline he imposed on them, the questions he encouraged them not to ask, the witness accounts that were buried, the physical evidence that was handled in ways that made independent verification impossible. The man who had the most to gain from a quick, clean, uncomplicated conclusion controlled the process that produced one. Robert Kennedy spent 5 years watching this, 5 years building toward a moment when he would have the power to do something about it, 5 years of silence that was not cowardice but strategy. And in a kitchen hallway in Los Angeles, someone made sure that moment never came. Whether Sirhan acted alone, whether the same networks that may have arranged Dallas also arranged the Ambassador Hotel, whether the official account of Robert Kennedy's death is any more trustworthy than the official account of his brothers, these questions remain genuinely open to anyone willing to look at the acoustic evidence, the trajectory of the bullets, the number of shots that witnesses reported hearing, the question of whether Sirhan's gun, which held 8 rounds, could account for all of them. What is not open to question is what Robert Kennedy believed. He never said it publicly. He understood what public accusations without proof would accomplish. But his actions, his private words, his choices in the 5 years between Dallas and Los Angeles compose a statement as clear as any he ever made on the record. He believed his brother was murdered by a conspiracy. He believed the Warren Commission had not told the truth. He believed the CIA, organized crime, and anti-Castro exile networks had been involved. And he believed that the man who sat in the Oval Office in the aftermath had not been uninvolved in what was arranged and had certainly done everything in his power to ensure it remained unanswered. Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be the one who kept things safe. He carried that weight for 5 years. The guilt of the survivor, the fury of the witness, the cold determination of a man who has decided that justice delayed is not justice denied, only deferred. They killed the president in Dallas. They silenced his brother with guilt and isolation and powerlessness. And when that brother built himself back into someone who could actually threaten them, who had the power and the platform and the plan and the path to the White House, someone stepped from behind a dish cart in a kitchen hallway in Los Angeles, and the Dallas file went with him. The truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people need it to. It waits in sealed archives, in testimony that was never taken seriously, in the private words of men who knew things and chose their moments carefully and then ran out of time. It waits in the gap between what was said publicly and what was said in private. It waits in the space between the Warren Commission's confident conclusion and Robert Kennedy's quiet, devastating assessment. A shoddy piece of craftsmanship. The Kennedy assassinations remain the most consequential unsolved questions in American political history. Not because they are mysteries in the conventional sense, because the people with the power to answer them have always had more to gain from silence than from truth. And the silence continues.